Hello, I'm Colin Gallagher, CEO at Onward and Upward, and you're listening to the Association 100 podcast, where each week we interview association leaders from across the country to hear how they're trying new things, taking big risks, and delivering value for their members. We'll explore the realities of what it means to work in and with associations and bring you the insights and inspiration you need to advance your career and make big changes at your association. Let's get started. Welcome back to the A100 podcast. I'm your host, Colin Gallagher, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. My guest today is Tara Puckey, the Executive Director at the Radio Television Digital News Association and Radio Television Digital News Foundation. She first began working with the association in 2018 as its Director of Strategic Initiatives and is ultimately tasked with advancing the organization's mission and expanding its impact. Prior to her position there, she served as the Society of Professional Journalists Interim Executive Director, Associate Executive Director, and Membership Strategist. Throughout her career, Tara has trained more than 1,400 journalists and nonprofit professionals in effective leadership and worked with countless associations and journalism organizations to build strategic plans for a successful future. Tara, thanks so much for joining us on the A100 today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited.
Great. So before we really jump into things, for our listeners who are familiar with your association, I'd love to hear a bit more about your mission and your members.
Yeah, so the Radio Television Digital News Association, RTDNA for short, because that's a bit of a mouthful. Our members are leaders in television, radio, and digital journalism organizations. We primarily have news directors in local TV outlets, local radio, and then digital pure play as well. And then sprinkled in there, we also have folks who are on the production side. So executive producers, we have on-air talent, so reporters, multimedia journalists. It's really a place for anyone who is involved in the journalism craft to be able to come for tools, resources. We recognize excellence in journalism. And so it's a wonderful gathering place and a wonderful community for something that is so critically important to our democracy.
Yeah, what a time for this role. I'm sure it's incredibly valuable for your members. That's awesome. In the association world, one thing we've heard a lot over these last few years is this new remote work world, hybrid, you name it. But how have you adapted to the challenges and opportunities presented by this? And have you found strategies that have been really effective?
That's a great question. So when I first came on board with RTDNA, I was remote, but we had some in-office staff. We were a bit of a hybrid model, I would say. We had some folks in DC, and then we had some folks who were remote. And that presents challenges, just like having an all in-office staff or an all remote, right? Everyone has different challenges. What happened, though, was we realized that being an all remote staff, we're a super small team. So at that time, we were like 5 full-time staff. Being remote allowed us to do several things. One, it allowed us to offer some benefits from a work-life balance perspective. And I hate the word balance because I think work-life integration is so much more of what we're actually talking about here. It allowed us to offer that to people. It also allowed us to look at talent in so many more areas than just the Metro DC space. And we decided as a team to go fully remote like March 1st of 2020, which was before everybody else started going remote.
What did you guys know?
I know, by about 4 days. So I don't want to say we started a trend because it was like a very troubled time. But I will say it was really nice for us to be prepared before everybody else started to be scrambling. So it allowed us to hit the ground running. Now, there was things we were still learning as we went. I would say in terms of what it allowed us to do, aside from those first two things, was be really intentional about how we spend our time as a staff together, very intentional about how we spend our time communicating. So a couple of things that are really important to us. You have to be incredibly intentional about the culture you're creating in a virtual environment. You have to be intentional in an in-person environment as well, but I don't think it takes quite as much time, effort, planning in different ways than it does when you're a virtual team. So our staff gathers in different places around the country multiple times throughout the year. for several days together. We do strategy work, but we also do that really important piece of building culture, which is not work. We are just existing together. So we visited an alpaca farm on one of our staff retreats. That was
That's
super
so
fun.
cool.
We did a swamp gator tour in New Orleans as part of our staff retreat. And because we recognize that you don't just bring your work skills to work, you bring your whole self to work. And so if we're not able to gather people around a physical water cooler, we have to create those times and those experiences and that space for them to be able to connect in meaningful ways. So for us, we're really intentional about when we gather and how. We have events throughout the year, so we're seeing each other at those as well. But we feel like having that dedicated time as a staff to be able to come together, talk about goals, but also just gather as a community that we are is really important.
Yeah, I think that dedicated time. I mean, that's what matters because that's what builds the connection that stays then when you are remote and you're not together. Have you hired any new employees in that time? And do you have any thoughts on how to onboard someone in an environment like that, especially if there's not an immediate retreat or your group gathering coming up?
Yeah, we have. We do a couple of things, and I will say everybody's process in terms of remote work looks different. I think it's having a process is the key part there, right? And so when we have new staff come on, we have simple surveys where we ask them questions about who they are, right? Like, what's your favorite candy bar? What's the last book you read? What's the favorite thing that you're binging on TV right now? We share that with staff, and then we have staff share that back with the new person. So when they first start, and all of this happens before their first day. So when they first start, they really feel like they're coming in knowing at least a little bit about their colleagues. And then if we don't have that immediate staff retreat, we're planning some virtual gatherings, happy hours, welcome parties, where that person's able to connect virtually and it's not just about the work. And so it doesn't have to look like that, but it has to look like something, right? Your onboarding checklist has to not just be set up their email, tell them their phone number, like all of those things. It has to be, how do we welcome them in as a person? How do we introduce the team to them? And then how do we introduce those cultural norms, which I think is the hardest part because it is really hard to tangibly explain expected behavior norms within a team. And so we haven't cracked that nut. I don't know that anybody has 100% effectively. What I can say is we're trying to get better at it every year, which is we are gathering up hey, here's some expected behavior norms. Part of our staff retreats are working to build some community guidelines for how we interact with one another and how we show up. And so we're doing a little bit more every time, and it's top of mind. But I think that's the key is just recognizing that you have to do that additional piece.
Yeah, that's so smart. And I think two things you said that really resonated for me are that having a process, and because without it, things don't work. And then being able to have that dedicated time for people that makes them feel like them as a person. And they're not just another clog in the machine and just someone that's there to do work and nothing else. And bringing your whole self to work, that matters for
Yeah.
people. The process part makes me laugh a little because we're a young organization. We launched during COVID. So we actually started fully remote and then tried to do hybrid, back to fully remote now, and it's working really well. But the best thing we did was maybe a year and a half or 2 years in was we hired an operations person.
Yeah.
And she has put all of that in place where we have a real onboarding checklist. And just so you said, my business partner, she laughed and she was like, I always thought onboarding was filling out your HR paperwork. She was like, I had no idea it involved all of these meetings with different people you're going to work with, meetings with people you're not going to work with, but who are on the team, ways to get to know how we do things and what our values are. So when you talked about culture and how hard that is to define that, what are you doing to try and have people feel that culture when they're not all in the same place?
I think it continues to be really hard. What I will say is if you don't do work to define your culture, someone else will define it for you. And the likelihood of that being what you want is slim to none, right? And it doesn't mean that you have to do it perfectly all the time, every time, but it does mean that you have to be conscious about how that looks, how that works, and building in those processes. I love that you shared that little bit because I was like, oh, we have some things we could add now, right? Like, hey, on your onboarding checklist, let's schedule some meetings where we can learn about each other and learn about what they do there. And we just thank you for that. So now I'm going to go put it on my list. There we go. Pick it up. I think we are all continuing to learn, right? And so one of the things that I think has been great about what we've been able to do at RTDNA, we recently enacted unlimited PTO, which has pros and cons, just like everything else. One of the cons being that people don't always take all of their time. So one of the things we did was say you have a minimum that you have to take. You have to take 3 weeks throughout the year. But it allowed us to be more flexible with our schedules, which allowed people to feel like they could share a bit more about themselves, right? Like, hey, I'm starting yoga classes every Tuesday morning at 10 because that's when the class is. And I'm going to be out of pocket from 10 to 11. And that's okay. Or I'm taking the dog to the dog park at the end of the day. And so it weirdly was like an unintended consequence of having people just say when you're going to be online, when you're not online, but it started to allow them to like share more of who they were as well. And I think we've been lucky in the fact that our team is just a really great team, right? Like we work really hard. We also like to hang out and play hard, right? We enjoy spending time together. So we've been really lucky in the sense that it wasn't as hard as it could have been in terms of building that culture in that team.
That's a good way to look at it. And I feel like that helps with the inclusivity piece too, because I do think that's a big challenge with fully remote is making everyone feel like they're included, like they're getting the same kind of treatment. And I think that actually comes in more play with hybrid when it's tough for people that are not in the office feel like they're not getting the same kind of attention. So there's a lot of challenges around inclusivity for sure.
Yeah. What I will say is I think not only do you have to have a process, but that process requires money. This is always the thing when people are like,
you gotta invest.
What in your team? That costs money to send them like snack packs. Yes, it does. And it costs money to fly them out to a location and gather for 2, 3, 5 days. And it costs money to do outings or to take everybody to dinner at events or whatever that looks like. Yes, absolutely. I think sometimes people forget. Do you not remember how much money you were spending on an office? Like at one point? So you're transferring your investment. It doesn't mean that investment goes away. It just shows up differently. Because if you don't invest in that way, then it's not going to work, right? It's just not. You cannot have an intentional remote culture that is 100% free. It won't work.
Yeah. I'm curious, do your members, do they know it's fully remote? Do they have opinions on that? Do they think it's better or worse? I would love to know if the members have a perspective on that.
That's a good question. And I don't know, like we've ever actually asked intentionally in any way. What I will say is our leadership team and our board obviously knows everyone is remote. I think they recognize that it allows us to reach into a deeper talent pool than was previously accessible to us. And it allowed us to save in different ways. And so again, that savings flexes and the spend is in different ways. I don't know that our general membership knows that the team is fully remote. What I will say is I think post-COVID, when we have calls with people and we're talking to people, it doesn't seem abnormal to anyone anymore, right? I think those conversations would have been so different in 2019 than they are now. Like one of the first questions people usually ask is, so where are you located? Even though our mailing address is online, they recognize that the likelihood of our team all actually being there isn't as great as it once was. I think it has become a more accepted practice, right, over time, and more people are doing it and they recognize what it looks like. And in the benefits, I think where it becomes different for people is they're like, I could never do that. And that's okay. Like, it's not for everybody. I fully recognize that some people do much better in a physical environment, a physical office environment where they have others around them. So I don't know. I don't think it's bothered anybody thus far, but that's a good question.
Yeah, I was just curious because we work with several small staff associations that have also gone fully remote, and I think it works so well for them. And the biggest thing is the talent pool that it's opened up.
Yeah.
They're competing with a lot of big associations in the DC area that have
deep pockets, and not that small staff associations don't or can't pay the same, but it does give you more opportunity to reach more people and to get some amazingly talented people you would just never know about otherwise. So that's, I think, the biggest benefit.
Yes. Yep. I would agree. And I do think to a certain extent, having a remote team and building that culture is a bit easier when you have a small staff. It is
That's fair.
extra hard when you have 100, 200, 300
Right.
people, right? And you're trying to figure out how to make this one cohesive culture. I would also argue that's difficult in person, but I do think it is easier oftentimes for a small staff to be able to move to remote and then start building that culture relatively quickly in terms of making sure that it's something that they want to see.
Yeah. For associations that are making changes now, obviously everyone did at least temporarily go fully remote during COVID. But I do think with the changing expectations of the younger growing workforce, we're going to see more and more of a shift in that direction. What would be your top piece of advice if they're making this change now and after having gone back to in office?
Oh, also a good question. I will say just like I will never go back to an in-office job. I just won't take one, right? I enjoy the flexibility. I don't even have small kids at home anymore. Like my kids are in college, and people who do have small kids and who have kids who are in activities, there is a great benefit there, I think, for being able to show up for your family. And people prioritize differently post-COVID, period. I guess biggest pieces of advice, right, which would be approach the entire thing with an open mind and a place of inquiry. Because I think the most prevalent mistake lots of organizations make is saying, this won't work for us, full stop. Because then you never started to explore what this could look like, the benefits, any of those pieces. I think there's just some folks who are so resistant to a remote team that it does a disservice to not only their organization, but the folks that they're leaving. So it doesn't work for everybody, but you'll never know unless you approach it with a curious mind.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think that applies to pretty much everything we do in business. If you can't look at it from that perspective of, let me take a chance, let me explore that, it doesn't mean it has to work. It has to be the way for you, but at least think about it. I think that's a really good way to look at it. Shifting gears a little bit, you can tell that you've done like leadership training and that you have those leadership qualities built in innately and clearly support your team. And I think that's where it starts. And I think well-supported association teams can support their members. And what are those key services your staff are doing in supporting those members? Like, how are you providing them educational resources, and how does that piece of that work?
Yeah, I would say we probably struggle in the same way that lots of other associations do, which is the rapid pace of change right now makes it difficult for associations to figure out what everybody needs at any given time, because 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, it's already changed. And then to be able to deliver those programs and services in a quality, responsible, ethical, take your pick of all of those words that your programs and services truly should be at the pace that they are needed. So I think RTDNA struggles in that same way, which is the journalism industry has been rapidly changing over the last 10 years, 5 years, 2 years, year, when you think about things like AI and what those changes mean. And I feel like we've been having these conversations around technology and journalism and the intersection of how that advances the future and the public's need to know, right? So RTDNA specifically has honed in on a couple of places. One, which is we believe truly that you can lead from wherever you are within a newsroom, right? Your leadership is not just tied to a specific title or specific quality. It truly is everybody can show up as a leader, and that's really important. And so that's been our frame of reference for our audience. The second piece of that is leadership for us is foundational. We can help train on skills related to AI or ethical decision making or better audio in journalism, like whatever that means. But if you don't have good leaders who are setting the tone for their teams in terms of learning new skills, a desire to learn, so being supported to learn, creating an environment where they have the ability to be open and ask questions and prompt to do things different and innovate and change. If you don't have leadership doing those things, then the skills don't quite matter as much, right? And so for us, we've laid that general foundation of leadership being important and then supplemented that with the changing kind of more direct needs of the journalism industry. But it's a struggle. It changes so rapidly, and there are so many facets of it that we're trying to pay attention to. It seems though as though there's always a new need, and we're always trying to figure out how we meet that. And I don't think we're alone in that. I think every association is facing that to some degree right now.
I think that's accurate. It's just wild to think how quickly so many things have changed in the last 1, 3, 5 years. It just really, the pace of change. Obviously, there's been huge changes, other over points over the last 100 years, but the pace of change now is just so fast.
Yeah.
One more thing, thinking about your members. So obviously, we're seeing more minority representation in radio news. Talked about supporting inclusion with your team. What about efforts in the industry? Are there things you guys are doing, or are you supporting greater industry efforts? What's the main things going on that front?
Yeah. I think we are also in the same camp with lots of other associations that are struggling with this as well. And I think you have two areas to consider. One is diversity, equity, inclusion within your own association, but then also within the industry that you serve. And those are two different things that sometimes require different mechanisms to be pulled. You, of course, have different influences in both of those spaces. And what does that look like? For us, one of the things that has continued to be important at RTDNA is measuring and making sure that we are sharing that information so the industry is able to recognize that we're not there yet, right? We're not where we need to be. We still have more growth, whether it's in salary or leadership positions, or people within the newsroom in general, right? For us, it's really important that newsrooms look like the communities they cover, because it allows them to make sure that they are accurately and adequately telling the stories of their communities. And so that's in that space. And then what I will say from an association space is continues to be one of the really important things that we feel like should be baked into everything that we do. So when we look at board leadership, when we looked at committee composition, when we look at trainers or presenters for a variety of programs and services that we provide and produce, that has to be something you're thinking about. I think one of the challenging questions associations struggle with is, right, like, do we have a DEI committee, right? And that it does good work, right? I'm not saying it doesn't. That can't stand alone. It has to be baked into everything that you do, and you have to be intentional about what that looks like. And we're not doing every piece and part of it right. I think that's the thing about diversity, equity, inclusion is that it continues to be a journey, and there should not be a point where that journey is done. We continue to learn, to explore what we're able to do better, how we can create greater impact, what that looks like, what's necessary and needed from us. And I think that's the key is just continuing to figure out how do we be better, asking the right questions, asking the question at all of what are the areas that we can improve in and how are we able to influence this, both within the association, but also the industry.
I love that way of thinking, and just that you're doing while you're learning. We talked to someone on this podcast earlier in the year about DEI and how to do it right. And the biggest thing she said was just start. You're not always going to do it right.
Yeah.
She said the worst thing you can do is be afraid to do it wrong and not do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. This has been so fascinating. And it's just a topic that every association cares about right now and has to be thinking about it as we think about the workforce of the future. So really appreciate all of your insights. But before we let you go, we like to wrap up every podcast with some just for fun questions to get to know you a little bit. So our first one was easy. Tell me where you grew up.
I grew up in Muncie, Indiana, which is the home of Ball State University, ironically referred to as Funcy because it's not always super fun or it's sometimes too much fun. I'm not sure which is more appropriate. Too funny.
Okay, what is your Starbucks soda or go-to morning drink if you're not a Starbucks fan?
So I will drink Starbucks, but I drink Monster energy drinks. I fully recognize that it's not healthy for me. I listen, I know all of these things. I still can't not do it.
I can't judge. I'm sitting here with a can of regular Coke and all the sugar that comes in it, so I won't judge. Okay, if you won the lottery tomorrow, would you still work?
I won so hard. So I'm gonna probably be honest and say no, right? Travel is like the thing that gives me the most joy in life. And I would probably wrap up. I wouldn't like cold turkey not show up tomorrow. But I would probably wrap up and spend the rest of my days just traveling.
I'm with you 100%. And it's funny because I'm very much known as a workaholic and I love my work and I'm so passionate about it. But I'm like, I want to go everywhere and I want to do everything. And if I had unlimited money, I'd be like, okay, I'll help you get settled, get all settled, and then bye, guys.
That's exactly.
Not too funny.
All right, what's the last TV show you binge watched?
The West Wing is my absolute favorite show ever. And generally, when I have a hard week, I will sit down and binge a good portion of the whole show. So I did that last week.
I love that show. I seriously credit that with what brought me to DC all those years ago because I was binge watching the syndicated version in between my morning and afternoon classes every day at school and decided I didn't want to. I was a journalism major, decided I didn't want to work for a newspaper and ended up in grad school in DC the next year for PR. And now I've been here since that was 2006. I came down.
I've loved It is truly one of the best pieces of television ever.
Wow. It's so good. All right. What's a food you can't live without?
Oh, pierogies.
Nice. And finally, you mentioned you want to travel. So where's that bucket list travel destination?
I saw this question and I felt very afraid of it because I don't know that I have just one, right? I have a lot. I will also say I've been super lucky in being able to visit lots of my bucket list destinations. Bora is on my list. I got to hit the Maldives, so that one got checked off, which was beautiful and amazing and incredible.
That's on my list.
Bora is also on my list.
That's good stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of amazing places out there.
Yes.
Awesome. Tara, thanks again. I so appreciate you sharing your smarts with us on the A100 today.
Thank you so much. It was super fun.
That's a wrap for today's episode. The Association 100 podcast is a production of Onward and Upward Marketing and Communications, where our mission is to make associations and nonprofits the go-to source in their industries through earned media and thought leadership. This podcast is an extension of the A100 newsletter, a bi-monthly collection of best practices, top trends, helpful ideas, and smart strategies delivered straight to your inbox. Have you undertaken a big change at your association, or do you have some words of wisdom for the trenches of association life? We want to hear from you, and so do our listeners. Drop us a note at info@onwardupward.com. That's info@onwardupward.com. If you like what you heard today, be sure to subscribe, give us a 5-star review, and share with your friends and colleagues. We're available anywhere podcasts are found. Come back next week for more association inspiration and insights. Thanks for tuning in.